Welcome to day 2 of Black Hat 2024. I'm Jeff Mann, co-host on Paul's Security Weekly. We are broadcasting live from the beautiful suite here at Four Seasons Hotel. It's still hot because it's Vegas in August. Why we do it in August, I have no idea. I'm here today talking with Danny Jenkins. He's co-founder and CEO of a company called ThreatLocker. Danny, welcome.
Thank you for having me on today.
How are you liking the show so far?
Great. It's busy. Every year we come here, it gets busier, more people, more heat.
I assume you guys have a booth on the trade room floor?
We have a very big booth and a lot of people down there at the moment. Expecting a busy
One of these days I will try to get down there, but I'm doing these interviews most of the day. Danny, tell us a little bit about your background, how you got into cybersecurity, and how you ended up starting this company called ThreatLocker.
So it started off before cybersecurity existed. I left school at 15. I started working in IT at 16, and I started off an apprenticeship, and I worked very, very quickly up in the IT world. I worked at what would be known as an MSP today, but it wasn't called an MSP back then.
Gotcha.
I then worked corporate IT, and very quickly that became corporate IT security because I was at the head office of a multinational company, and they suddenly had all these malware and issus related to security.
So what time frame are we talking?
We're talking, this was 2000, I think I started at corporate IT in 2001, I want to say.
Okay.
I started in IT in 1997.
Gotcha. Okay. I still have you beat by a little bit, but that's all right. I have most people beat. It's funny because back then, one of the arguments that we used to make when I came out into the private sector in 1997 and trying to convince companies, hey, if you're going to plug in this thing called the internet, you got to do something like to secure your stuff. And very quickly, the conversation became, where do you put security in an organization? And for whatever reason, they slapped it into IT, which I've always thought was a bad idea. But, all right, so you got into it. You sort of grew up through the ranks. What did you see that made you think we can do this better?
So I think the first thing, I saw constant failure for decades.
Yep.
And it wasn't that significant. So if I go back to 2001, actually, I was working in corporate IT. I remember the love bug in the corporate network. I remember every machine getting done. And then 2002, we saw the blaster virus. These were real pain points from an IT person point of view, but they weren't pain points from a business point of view because my computer got a virus, the IT guy cleaned it, and that was kind of the mentality.
Right.
And for decades or for years over years, we just kept missing. And I think in 2014 was when I really realized we've got to change the way we do this. And it was the first ransomware recovery I actually worked on. So I spent about 4 years doing ethical hacking, but I'd say 2.5 of those turned into mostly ransomware recoveries because people would ask me to help with their ransomware recoveries.
Right.
And there was one in 2014 and it completely destroyed the business. They paid the ransom, they didn't get their data back. And suddenly it was much more important to detect all malware at 0 day. And that's really where we thought about ThreatLocker. How can we change this from a detection point of view to a protection where we actually block
So
by
actually
default?
do some prevention rather than just constantly cleaning up the mess.
Yeah, because it was impossible to detect everything that was out there.
Right.
And we've seen it and since 2014 it's just got worse and worse and worse and worse. Ransomware attacks are growing, malware attacks are growing, cyber attacks are growing, the misuse of applications. So by changing that paradigm to default deny as opposed to default allow, all we had to do was figure out how do we make that viable and simplistic for a business without interfering with their business.
So you've been around long enough to remember the whole concept of plug and play and screaming at vendors to, could you please give us some secure configurations right out of the box? But of course, they wanted everything to work right out of the box.
And that's the problem. Developers write code to perform a function.
Right.
They don't think about writing code to stop someone performing a bad function.
Right.
And when you create things like that, all software has vulnerabilities, it has bugs and drivers, hardware sets, all allows misuse. I think we actually saw one even last year. We found a vulnerability in Apple, which their response was it was a feature where we could gain full control over a Mac just by intercepting the Bluetooth connection between the AirPods and the Mac. We were able to put malware, download files from it and everything.
Yeah, those of us that are older kind of are not necessarily optimistic that this ever gets solved. I feel like sometimes we opened up this Pandora's box because we've created all this amazing technology that connects people and has instant access to information, and the idea of securing that information it seems like it's always been an afterthought, if it's thought about at all.
And I don't know if it gets solved, but I think it gets better. One of the previous company I ran before this was an email security company.
Okay.
And at the time, if we go back to the first decade of the century, email security, spam, Viagra, all sorts of crap that would fill up all the mailboxes. And
right.
it was killing businesses, and they couldn't get to the end of it. And email security technologies got so advanced when it came to filtering out spam, and now there's a whole bunch of new issues with email security, but spam filtering made it unviable for them to stay in business.
Right.
So, and yes, there's still spam today, but it's not nearly as bad as it was at its peak in 2010 or whatever that may have been. The same applies with ransomware. These guys are business operators. If we can make their life difficult and they can't make money doing this, then we win in general. Now, it's never going to be perfect, but we can make it better. It just means taking steps, implementing controls that really makes their life hell. And if you put big, strong bolts on your doors, you put security cameras, you got an alarm system, and someone tries to break in and they kick the door and they get the crowbar and it won't open, they just give up. They go to the neighbor. And that's kind of what we need to do. It's not impenetrable, but if you have security that's of a least privilege, it makes it harder for them to do their job, and you're now the least likely person to be attacked. And eventually they just go out of business, like the spammers did.
Yeah, I mean, I learned cybersecurity, and we didn't call it that back then. We called it initially communications security, then information security, but in the DoD. And that was one of those neglected principles that didn't seem to translate well into the private sector, is the idea of you don't have to like lock everything down so it's impenetrable, just make it not worth the while of the attacker or the bad guy to even bother. So very similar to the analogy you just said. I used to talk about, if there's a thief driving into a neighborhood, he's looking for the house that's easiest to break into and steal stuff, not necessarily, that house clearly has the best things. But he was looking also for the levels of defenses and protections, and it's nearly impossible to defend a house against somebody that really, really wants to get in there. There's always the second floor, there's the back doors, I had somebody tell me one time when I was giving them the analogy, heck, most houses are built with siding and drywall, just cut a hole in the wall. I'm like, yeah, that's true. So, you're understanding sort of older original concepts. You started this company called Threat Locker. You've been in business a while. You've survived the whole COVID thing. What are you guys doing today? What are you doing right now to try to help organizations be better and survive, really?
So what we've done is we've built this endpoint protection platform. Okay. And rather than building it on the idea of detecting threats, we built it on the idea of, okay, what is malware? Malware is software. What if we could block all software except the software that they need? And then we've dealt with those issues because there's a whole bunch of new issues with updates and everything else around that. So we've dealt with those issues rather than trying to deal with the malware issue. And then by default, we block ransomware and malware. And we saw that with Exchange vulnerability. We've seen it with the Kaseya vulnerability in 2021. We've seen it over and over again. WannaCry was the first big success. And it was at that point when WannaCry came out, we knew that we were on something really, really big because it was very, very successful. And then we've extended that, and it's a whole platform. So it's not just, hey, blocking software, but what does the software that you run need to do? So you can deploy Threat Locker and it'll say, this is all the apps on your machine. Everyone says they've got 10 apps. They've normally got 300 because they don't realize about that Logitech.
Especially if it's Windows.
Logitech webcam support app. And then we'll show them that this was made in China, this was made in Russia, this is what this application has access to. PowerShell has access to all of these files and it can be used for this. But what we'll do is we'll say, this is what we recommend you give it access to. So we'll actually put controls, we'll ring fence those applications and put controls around them. And then we'll go into storage and network controls. And yes, we have an EDR and we have an MDR that backs that up. But the idea of detection is when you messed up on the protection. Detection is only relevant if you don't have security in place in the first place. I don't believe detection is security. It's an alarm. Someone just broke into your house. And hopefully you get them out before they steal too much.
Well, it might be semantic, but I think detection is part of security because I think all the things that you do to prevent bad things from happening, locking down, securing all the things, is sort of table stakes. And to me, security is really what you do to figure out something bad's going wrong. But I'm a little bit idealistic, and I come from a DoD background where I think pragmatically in the real world, in the private sector, more and more people need things that just work, because the idea of having to constantly be vigilant and detecting and protecting,
you can't keep up. Well, and I think the point is a burglar alarm in your house isn't going to stop somebody breaking in, but it may make them leave, and it may stop them. And that's the idea of detection. And we have probably, or arguably, the best MDR in the world. We've got US-based MDR that responds on average in 23 seconds. Wow. So we have that, but every time we get an alert, it's normally because something else was configured wrong or allowed wrong on the other side, because the IT guy allowed TeamViewer, or despite the fact that all the tools were there, they opened RDP on the internet or something like that. So it's important, but it's also, it should be the backup plan and not the core of how you stop people getting into your environment.
Gotcha. What do you find to be your key market, the sweet spot for people that are wanting to use your products?
So I think the bigger area, it ranges. So we do very well in small businesses through managed IT companies, but we also do very well in large enterprises, banks, hospitals. JetBlue is a customer of ours, and they're very, very successful, and they're deployed everywhere. So we have this kind of range across the board. I think our target audience is really IT departments or security departments that have personnel. So if it's a small business, like a dental office that doesn't have their own IT team, we're targeting their provider. If it's a large enterprise, and we do really well in a lot of the large enterprises, we've got quite a lot in aviation, certainly aviation that's not gone down this week, but and that's really where we're coming from, is get it to the IT people. And I think the sweet spot for us is probably anything from 500 up to 100,000, 200,000 endpoints.
Gotcha. I'm curious, this is a little bit maybe off topic, but just given your background growing up through corporate IT and just seeing all the frustrations and challenges, and not intending to disparage anybody, because it could have happened to anybody, but what is your take on things that happened a couple weeks ago that kind of caused a few significant outages across the world?
So I think, first of all, I mean, it's what keeps me up at night.
Because it wasn't really it wasn't a security issue.
No, it was. It
was an IT issue.
It was a infrastructure issue, we'd call it. But I think there are things. First of all, hindsight's 2020. It's very easy to say 2020. This should have been done different. This should have been done different. And it's what keeps me up at night. We think about every possible chain, and we've built constraints into our update process. We have independent teams that push shards on servers to make sure everything's validated. QA has a separate. So we've done those things. I think the challenges and what happened 2 weeks ago woke up the world. And there's two problems at the cause of this. One is we're updating security solutions that are core into the operating system 10 times a day because we have to. And we have to do that to stop threats. And that's back to the point of we shouldn't be chasing threats that much. We can't rely on 10, 12 updates a day where mistakes can be made. I think it could have been a lot worse, and that's what everyone's underestimated. If this had been a ransomware attack or something at that scale, we wouldn't be talking about a week to get people up and running. We're talking about months or years in a lot of business. So it could have been a lot worse. It wasn't a security incident, but it was a change control issue. And
I mean, I do PCI. I've been doing PCI for 20 years, which is a standard that walks through all the things that you should do to create a secure environment. And I could just think of a half dozen things that a particular company probably wasn't doing or kind of got a little bit lax. I'm sure, and again, I'm not meaning to disparage them, I'm sure there was a bunch of little things that happened over time that created that perfect storm. But most companies out there are in that same boat.
Oh, of course. And it scares me, and it's why we put so many checks and balances in place, and we do so many updates slowly, because what I imagine happened, and the update file that was pushed out, it wasn't half a file, but it was half the size of the regular file, which indicates to me that somebody copied the wrong file onto the server. And now the way that those files were loaded is Microsoft require you to sign drivers. So whenever you make a change to your driver, you have to submit your driver to Microsoft with its essentially PBB file to review the source code, and they spit you back a signed driver from Microsoft to say, hey, we've vetted this driver. it's not a security risk. You're now allowed to push this out to our customers.
Right.
And that process is a pain in the backside, to say the least. However, it means you're slowed down updating your driver. So what most security companies do is they'll run their business logic in a service, and they'll have the driver hooking into the service.
Gotcha.
What seemed to happen in this case is the instructions, the driver was almost like an empty shell that would actually pull instructions and logic into it. And that, when it got something it didn't expect, it crashed.
Right.
Because it didn't know how to handle that set of data. So if we think about, well, what could have been done, and hindsight's always 20/20, we probably could have had a scenario where the driver had better error control in it. The driver could have also just sent the data to the service to do processing. The update process could have been validated and checked better. And it's very easy to say in hindsight, but one of the things that we implemented was this idea of we have separate SHAs, and because at the end of the day, at some point, one guy one person has to copy this file to a server.
Right.
And then that server gets pushed. It could have been pushed in a slower metric. It could have had low risk clients push first, or things that aren't going to affect critical infrastructure. But the other thing that could be done is validation of that file from 2 other departments, which is the way we do it. So that file, the guy who pushes it can't, if he makes a mistake, all that's going to happen is the agent on the computer is going to say, this file isn't valid, and discard it.
Right.
And that's probably what should have happened, but hindsight's always easy to say after the
Sure.
fact. It keeps me up at night, this stuff, and we put so many controls to make sure they happen, and also don't have so many updates. Find a security solution that doesn't require 12 updates a day.
Right. Well, I mean, part of the principles of security that I learned years ago is, or have witnessed, is we learn from our mistakes, and we always get better as a culture and as an industry. Appreciate your time today. We've run out of time. I appreciate the context and the background, and having come out of the trenches. I get the sense that you have a really good feel for what works and what doesn't, and we encourage everybody to check out ThreatLocker and this idea and this approach of doing things a little bit differently. If you want to get more information, go to securityweekly.com /ThreatLocker BH for Black Hat. Danny, thanks for your time today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Great.